Good morning. I want to start by giving thanks to Urvashi and Liza for all their work these past few months and for including me in your lineup. It's really both an honor and an opportunity to go down a conceptual path I probably wouldn't otherwise have taken. So I'm looking forward to sharing some preliminary thoughts with you today and getting some feedback about the connections that I'm making between the sources I've brought to discuss today. So my talk today is both inspired by and structured around a trio of archival moments that are separated by time and space. So allow me to briefly sketch those moments before I dive in to grapple with their significance. And actually, since I'm up here, I think I can take my mask off. So the first moment comes to us by way of Joanne Rappaport's article in the Hispanic American Historical Review titled Así lo parece por su aspecto, Physiognomy and the Construction of Difference in Colonial Bogota. And it's a brief, almost fleeting archival moment that is inscribed in the 1630s when a witness in a civil suit was called upon per the conventions of record production in colonial Spanish America to identify herself according to her race. And according to the scribe, the woman described herself as a cuarterona and a mujer blanca. And by cuarterona, which is historically found in Genealogies, quadroon in English, she meant that she had 1/4 African ancestry. And by mujer blanca, she meant that she was a white woman. The second archival moment is part of what I'm calling the visual archive of Latin American history, which spans more than 5 centuries and a vast regional landscape. But in this instance comes out of a collection of 20 paintings that were commissioned by the Peruvian viceroy in the late 18th century, and they form part of the genre that's known as Costa painting. The collection is broken into 3 narratives of race mixing, one focused on Afro-Spanish unions, the other on indigenous Spanish unions, and the third on Afro-indigenous unions. And it's the first narrative that provides today's example because the final image in the series is one that features 3 people, a father, mother, and a third unidentified person. The father is described as an español, the mother is described as a gente blanca, and their child who is missing from the scene actually is described as quasi limpio de su origen, or almost pure of origin. And I'll talk more about the terms that appear in that image and the logic, or at least what I perceive to be the logic of those terms, briefly. But for now, I just want to highlight the fact that what the image is describing, among other things, is a Spaniard reproducing with someone several generations removed from unbaptized, unchristianized African ancestry to create, in this 8th generation, someone who is almost pure of origin. The third and final archival moment is one that I'm revisiting from my own earlier work, an article that I wrote several years ago in Gender and History titled Blanconas Sucias y Putas Putonas, White Women, Cross-Caste Conflict, and the Power of Words in Late Colonial Lima, Peru. And this moment is more expansive and extensive than the first one, in that it filled an entire case file from 1817 when a man filed a criminal complaint against 2 Black women who were referred to in the documentation as negras, and a little boy of mixed African and indigenous ancestry who was referred to as a sambo. There's some soundtrack that's happening outside, so forgive me if I'm a little distracted. And so the young boy is referred to as a sambo in the case file. And the reason the case exists is because the man who files the criminal complaint is accusing the 2 women of African descent and the young boy of indigenous ancestry of insulting his wife and his mother-in-law, his wife's mother. And the husband was vague in terms of what exactly was said to the 2 women, but neighbors who testified in the case filled in the gaps. And according to one of those neighbors, the accused women referred to the claimant's wife and mother-in-law as, and I quote, blanconas sucias y unas putas putonas. And there's no easy translation for the term, but they roughly translate to mean dirty whites and giant whores. So together, I think these three archival moments converge to offer some insights about genealogies of whiteness in Latin American history and the genealogies as evidenced by this archival corpus within Latin American history. So let's go to the first one. Again, it's a fleeting moment that forms part of a larger discussion in Rappaport's article about the tensions between physiognomy or aspect that she takes the title from and ancestry. And so it's a larger discussion, but there's this interesting moment that highlights change over time. Rappaport mentions that the term white in the Middle Ages denoted lethargy and dull-wittedness, but began to appear in physical descriptions of travelers from Spain to what's now Colombia in the late 16th century as something that was equated with Europeanness, as it's only Spaniards rather than Moors or people of indigenous ancestry or other forms of ancestry that she finds being described as white in color in the documentation from this particular corpus of travel records that she's looking at and comparing to contemporaneous sources produced in what's now Bogota. But then as the witness's self-description shows, we see in the 17th century a kind of slippage between white as a color on one hand, description, and white as a category of belonging on the other, and an unstable category at that. And it was one, as this, again, fleeting moment hints at, that people of African and indigenous ancestry could claim with relatively little pushback, claim both the color, if they so chose, and also the category itself, as evidenced by this cuarterona of African ancestry who also identifies as a mujer blanca. What's interesting as kind of context that looms over the archival moments that I'm talking about today is another convention of colonial record production in the Spanish American context, which is that it's only people who were understood to be or had a reputation for not being white or Spanish who had to identify themselves according to color term in the record. So it's kind of paradoxical in that and it'll come up in one of the cases that I talk about briefly, that you know that the person in the document is white or reputationally white if there's an absence of color terms. And if there's a presence, for example, of honorifics like don or doña. And so there's an interesting kind of logic at work in these documentations that if someone is understood to be white or perceived by the scribe who is compiling the record to be white, then they go unmarked by color terms in the record and have these honorific labels attached to their name. That doesn't mean that in every case that person is Spanish, but again, it just speaks to some of the logic undergirding these records and the metadata, I think, of these records. So even in this moment where this woman is identifying as a cuarterona and a mujer blanca, the fact that those terms appear on the record suggests a bit of tension between her self-perception and the perception of the notary, who seems to find it necessary that she identify according to the ancestry that must be present, either African or indigenous. So a fleeting moment with a bit of a fleeting description and analysis, because I think it provides some useful kind of foundational grounding for thinking about the 18th century, which is the time period I'm most familiar with and spend a lot of time writing about. And as we move into the 18th century, there still is something of a slippage between white as a color on one hand and a category on the other. But there's also an attempt to craft stricter boundaries between the two. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm making some leaps across time and space. We've gone from the 1630s in what's now Colombia to Peru in the latter part of the 18th century. And I don't mean, especially as an historian, to diminish the importance of temporal and regional specificity, but rather to highlight some moments that I think speak to one another and warrant deeper exploration that would then involve more careful attention to those regional differences and the temporal changes. But having said that, I want to return to the image that I opened with, and the caption that accompanies it. And the caption, again, was Español with gente blanca produces someone almost pure of origin. And again, this image comes from a collection of Casta paintings that were commissioned by the then Viceroy of Peru and sent to Spain. And I just want to note that I talk about these images in my book, Exquisite Slaves, which is over there on the table. Thanks for including it in the mini bookstore over there. But I'm not going to be repeating myself today. So I'm thinking about the same sources in a different way and hopefully going in a different direction. But it's worth saying a few things about these images just kind of off the top. First, as I mentioned, these images were commissioned with a specific audience in mind. And that, for those of you who are familiar with the better known genre of Mexican Casta paintings, is a point of differentiation, because in the case of the Mexican ones, they circulated around what's now Mexico or New Spain and were commissioned by local patrons as well as overseas patrons, and had multiple artists responsible for the creation of these images. Whereas in the Peruvian context, they were produced by not necessarily one artist, it's an anonymous artist, but more likely a workshop that involved multiple hands at work in the crafting of these images. But they were intended not to remain in Peru and to circulate among a local audience, but rather to go to Spain, and in particular to be housed in the Museum of Natural History in Spain. And to this day, they hang in Spain, in Madrid, in a museum of anthropology. So it gives you a sense of kind of the intentions behind the images, that they were not being produced as works of art, but rather kind of anthropological works or works of natural history. And they were produced in the Enlightenment era and speak, I think, the language of the Enlightenment era, or introduce a vernacular that is resonant with the era of the Enlightenment. The other thing to note is that there was a letter that the Viceroy sent to the Spanish monarch that accompanied this collection of images, and the letter served both as an introduction to the images and the reason for their creation, but also as a tool for reading the images. And I quote from the letter. He says that the paintings are meant to illustrate, and I quote, "the notable mutation of appearance, shape, and color that results from the successive generations of mixing between indios and negros, which," he notes, "is usually proportionately accompanied by inclinations and qualities." So they're meant to describe both the process of race mixing and the behavioral and attendant status evolution that arises as a result of that race mixing. So as a reminder, the image that I want to talk about out of those 20 comes out of the first of 3 so-called narratives of race mixture. In the first instance of mixtures between people of African descent and Spaniards, and in the others between people of indigenous ancestry and Spaniards and people of African and indigenous ancestry together. So I've provided on the right side of the screen a breakdown of the progression that the images chart from start to finish, beginning with the first generation of so-called negros bozales de Guinea. So these are, the term bozales refers to people who are non-Spanish speaking and unchristianized, ostensibly in this context recent arrivals from either West or Central Africa to Peru, which is where that population was, that African population was drawn from. So these are people in the first generation who haven't been subjected to enslavement and to colonial rule, or to the violence or linguistic and cultural indoctrination that came along with it. Then there's the second generation of so-called, look at the screen, a so-called negra de Guinea, or a criolla, someone born in the Peruvian context or the New World context. And together they would produce a mulatto. And then in the third generation, that mulata would reproduce with another person of mixed Spanish and African ancestry to produce together a mulatto. And I'll pause briefly to mention that the other thing the letter that accompanied the images said was that it should serve as a guide that the child in the previous image will then become the mother in the subsequent image and generation. And so there's a lot of kind of slippage between sex, because sometimes the child in the image is labeled with the masculine, but the idea is that they become the mother in the next image. And the point is that, one, Spanish men are the vehicles of race mixing with people of mixed racial ancestry, and Spanish women are entirely absent from that process of race mixing. So the only women involved in the process of race mixing are of African, indigenous, and mixed racial ancestry. And I'll come back to that later. So then we have the mulata reproducing with a Spaniard, a Spanish man, and producing what is called a cuarterón de mulato. So it kind of takes us back to that first archival moment that I mentioned, a woman who described herself as a cuarterona. And here it's kind of adding additional nomenclature, a cuarterona de mulato, which doesn't translate all that directly, but someone who's 1/4 of mulatto. And so this is where the nomenclature of the Peruvian genre of Costa paintings starts to get very interesting and also very different from the nomenclature of the Mexican Costa paintings, because nowhere in these are terms like lobo, coyote, tinte en el aire, all the terms that we are probably more familiar with in the case of the Mexican Costa paintings. And instead, there seems to be a more kind of scientific preoccupation, with kind of fractions of ancestry, to a point that gets kind of confusing. As in the 5th generation, where we have a Spaniard with a cuarterona producing someone who is a so-called quinterón de mulatos, someone who's 1/5 mulatto. So that's where it starts to get a little confounding. And then we've got in the 6th generation, a Spaniard with that quinterona de mulato producing a re quinterona de mulato. And so also untranslatable, but again, if nothing else, evidence of this attempt to create this sort of scientific measure of ancestry, even though it's kind of a impossibility, just given the nature of ancestry to be 1/5 something. So that's where it creates a conundrum, I think, for a contemporary reader of the images. And then in the 7th generation, we have a Spaniard reproducing with the re quinterona de mulato, and their child is what now is referred to as gente blanca. So white person, but also not Spanish, right? Not Espanol and not blanca. So it's kind of white, but not quite, right? With an asterisk, which I think is meaningful. And then finally, several generations removed from the African continent, and after several generations of a particular kind of race mixing, one that involves Spanish men over the course of several generations, is produced someone with almost pure origins, right? Someone who's almost pure, quasi limpio de su origen. But again, that child, that supposedly pure of origin child, is missing from the image. And it's not entirely clear why. I think, to my mind, and to my reading, it speaks to anxieties about the outcome of race mixing that were evident both in the Peruvian context, but also in the Mexican context, that produces similar kinds of, or speaks to similar kinds of anxieties. In the Mexican genre, there is, as I mentioned, the category tente en el aire, hold yourself in the air, no te entiendo, I don't understand you. So there are similar kinds of anxieties, but at least they're rendered in those images. Here they're absent, and I haven't quite worked through that. And to my knowledge, other scholars who've talked about this collection of images haven't either. But what is interesting is the presence of a figure reminiscent of that first generation, this dark-hued, presumably enslaved person who is either their human property or an alms collector. It kind of imagines a street scene or a domestic scene where someone is collecting alms. So either we imagine that this person indicates their status as slaveholders, their kind of hierarchical status that is also illustrated through the sumptuous clothing worn by the individuals in the image, or they're kind of placed within this urban landscape where they would be approached by an almsperson to collect and be able to provide, because they show the Spaniard in the image handing over a coin. So again, there's still, at this late point in the 18th century, a kind of slippage between white as a color and white as a category. It's an unstable category because of the proliferation of people of mixed racial ancestry, or at least it's evidenced by the proliferation of people of mixed racial ancestry. But there's still an attempt, at least in the language and the logic of these images, to use different language to kind of shore up the boundaries of whiteness and Spanishness in particular. And the use and the continued use of Spanish, Español, when it comes to the fathers in these images, is meant to connote a kind of unadulterated whiteness that will then triumph over successive generations, or to the degree that it's possible, triumph in the creation of gente blanca and their almost pure of origins descendants, who again are still not Spanish, not white, but close, right? Close, but not quite white. So now I want to turn to the final case. It's from 1817, as I mentioned earlier, when a man named Don Santiago, and here I emphasize Don, so he is not labeled in the record as a white man or a Spaniard, but the presence of that honorific suggests as much, or that at least he was able to convince the scribe compiling the record in the case and the courts, and in daily life operate as a Spanish man. And I say that not to go into a rabbit hole, but because there are instances that I've encountered in the archive of the presence of Don in records that are referring to people of African ancestry. But they've managed to shed that archival inscription. In any case, back to this complaint, it was against a woman named Teresa, her mother, Juana Medina, both of whom were described in the case as negra, so there's a clear inscription of racial terminology onto these women, and a little boy named Mariano, who was referred to as a sambito, so a young child, possibly Teresa's young child, and he's referred to as a diminutive of the term sambo. And so here we have this family in a conflict against another family, and in particular, Barrios alleged that Teresa, who's only known by her first name in the record, so missing any honorific, but also missing a last name, had come to the door of his home to demand payment for some fish and accused his dog of having eaten the fish and wants to be compensated for the loss of food that she was either planning to sell or eat and use to feed her own family. The claimant, the man, was not home at the time, but his wife, Maria, and his mother-in-law, Doña Petronila Lozano, were, and they refused to pay for the fish. And this leads to an altercation that involves Teresa, the so-called negra, physically attacking Maria with a knife and verbally insulting her and her mother-in-law. And again, the claimant feels uncomfortable recapping the terminology that was used, not just out of a sense of decency, but also because the risk that one takes when filing these insult claims, which is what the category of case this one belonged to was, is that you're making public this really embarrassing moment, and it's clearly embarrassing enough as to warrant a lawsuit that could then result in some sort of recompense or a public kind of apology, or some sort of a fine being levied, or punishment being levied. But the risk you take in doing that is to publicize the incident and to expose yourself to the embarrassment that you claim was so severe that this case needed to be filed. And so he's walking a fine line in terms of not repeating the language. But of course, in order to find out whether someone was ultimately guilty of wrongdoing, the courts have to figure out what exactly was said. And that's where the neighbor testimony comes in. And so one of the neighbors mentions that Teresa called the women of the house putas putonas, or giant whores. And also mentioned that Teresa removed her clothing and exposed her indecent parts to Doña Maria using many offensive words. So she's calling them blanconas sucias, dirty whites, and also exposing herself, which is kind of a strange combination of actions, starting with the verbal insults. They're difficult to translate, but we know that the term sucia means not only dirty as in physically dirty, but impure somehow, or can make reference to someone being sexually impure, if not racially impure. So it's a loaded term, but dictionaries from the era don't really offer definitions of terms like blanconas or putonas, right? So there seems to be some element of slang that's being invoked. So we can only approximate the words that were actually, or the meanings that were being communicated by these terms. But clearly the attempt was being made to insult these women, both in terms of their race and perhaps question the purity of their race, and to question their sexual morality. And this is a married woman. Her mother is a doña. These are women who have reputations that they felt in need of protecting. And of course, the husband is the one filing the suit, so he feels like his reputation is imperiled by the way his mother-in-law and his wife are being spoken to. And we hear in the case from the mother-in-law, who describes herself as a woman of quality who is married and who lives in a tranquil and peaceful marriage. And she says that there's nothing more serious than the distance between the offended persons, meaning herself and her daughter, and the injurers. The injurers, it is well known, belong to the plebeian class, while I live within the order prescribed by my religion and the law. For that reason, it is of the utmost necessity to correct their behavior. So here's this sense that, like, not only were these offensive words, but they were uttered by people who are beneath me, and something needs to be done to correct that. And so, meanwhile, despite the distance, she still felt it necessary, the husband still felt it necessary to file this claim. So clearly there is something about it that penetrated them. Then there's the question of Teresa's actions. So her words are one thing and they land a certain way. But I wonder about the logic of undressing herself and exposing herself to her female neighbors. And it's obvious that it was intended to cause offense, but I wonder what about the act was more injurious to their sensibilities and to her own and their dignity than to her own. And she doesn't testify in the case, so we don't know. And so all we're left to do is to wonder and imagine what she might have been thinking. And it's possible that in the same way that she drew upon what is clearly this sort of culturally specific set of terms and insults, she might also have had a culturally specific arsenal of physical insults as well. So there's the verbal and the physical converging in this moment. And maybe she saw exposing her body as an extension of the verbal insults, akin to using some kind of lewd hand gesture. But of course, we have to view her actions in the context of this hierarchical slaveholding society. She's presumably a free woman. She's not described as an esclava. No slaveholder is invoked or referenced in the case. But nonetheless, she lives in the context of a slaveholding society where Black women's bodies were sites of sexual, physical, and reproductive labor, and meant, in contrast, to underscore Spanish women's femininity and protection, being shielded from all those kinds of labor, or at least the labor in the form that it took among women of African descent. And so there's quite a lot happening in that moment. And I think it's useful to think about Theresa's actions as a desire to kind of pierce the protective shield surrounding white womanhood in that moment, even if it meant exposing herself, that sort of commentary that it offered. And clearly it too, like the verbal insult, landed in a way that required this case to be filed that brings it to our attention. I think it's worth noting too, just going back to the language of insult, that we don't usually see these sorts of moments get talked about. In part because they appear in these moments, unlike elite Spanish men who have all these forums in which to record their ideas about race. And that's what we as scholars spend so much time grappling with, what Spaniards thought about race, what Europeans more broadly thought about race. We don't often get windows onto how people of African descent or people of indigenous ancestry thought about race and how they thought about whiteness. And so I think what's useful about these particular examples is that it gives us a window, small as it is, confounding as it is, onto these populations' understandings of whiteness, or their refusal to submit to the demands of whiteness in this context, and instead to upend a sense of comfort and propriety and distance. They closed it both physically, they closed it verbally, they closed it in all these different ways. And so I see that as being worth paying attention to. And just to close briefly, I'm trying to think about what these three archival moments amount to, right? And what they can together kind of point to, and what they have to say about genealogies of race, and in particular genealogies of whiteness in the Latin American context. And I mean, in part, what I'm trying to highlight is the presence of this archival genealogy that gets us thinking about whiteness as color, whiteness as category, the instability of whiteness as a category, the way that changes over time, and the involvement of different actors in the definition and policing and penetrating of those categories over time. And then obviously there's this kind of true concept of genealogy that's playing out in the realm of visual discourse in the form of the Costa paintings, but also in the genealogy of linguistic terms that can be traced from the mujer blanca of the 17th century onto the gente blanca of the late 18th century, and then in the early 19th century, these dirty whites. So with that, I thank you for your time and look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Imposing this kind of, because it was chronological, it seemed at the beginning, and these were Mexican, that they almost seemed like they were claiming a certain kind of objectivity. They weren't doing anything. There's no narrative element. They're just kind of standing like a sample. Mm-hmm. And by the 18th century, there's always activity, and there's a lot of writing on the painting. So like if you're really a bad reader of activity and visual cues, it tells you what, like, there's a mulata looking in a mirror vainly while her kitchen's on fire. And there's a little Lobo boy sleeping and letting the cattle eat the corn and so on. And it says there you have a proclivity to laziness, etc. But they become more and more narrative, as though there's this preponderance to really make you understand that there are all sorts of moral categories and other. And is that something, as I said, I don't know if I'm forcing that. It just seemed like 18th century, there was a real change in a certain way. And I wondered about that.
Yeah. Well, I'll first say that your jump backwards example from the Mexican Costa paintings is a better analog to the missing child. The precise anxiety that I think it's articulating, the potential that they might turn out darker skinned, right? That like even over the course of successive generations, because genealogy isn't predictable, right? And so I think the removal of the child from the scene is kind of giving voice to that potential, right? That it is sort of unpredictable. And I talk about these images as kind of forms of ideation, right? They're not descriptive, they're prescriptive, and they represent a kind of hopefulness, but tinged with anxiety, right? And I think it kind of parallels that jump backwards, right? And yeah, in terms of those, the Mexican costume paintings, yeah, they're such vignettes, right? They have these narratives attached to them. There's also the one of the negra with the frying pan, right? Creating this scene of domestic chaos with the Spanish husband, and kind of morality tales. And in that way, it does kind of parallel just thinking about the letter that was written by the viceroy, who's talking about, in the Peruvian context, the notable mutation of appearances and inclinations and qualities. So there is a hint of that over time, there is a change. And in the third, I think the third category of costume paintings, the ones between people of indigenous and African ancestry, are more aligned with some of those, not in the same sense of there being vignettes, because across the board in the Peruvian costume paintings, there are no backdrops, so they kind of look like Sears portrait studio scenes, but they, at least through the clothing and even through the kind of posturing of some of the individuals, suggest some of that laziness or lack of industriousness, compared especially to the sort of more triumphant narratives that are coming through in the Afro-Spanish and the Indo-African ones. So all that to say, there is so much potential for really rich comparisons between the Mexican and the Peruvian ones, both in those ways, like the sort of moralizing that emerges out of them, and also the different ways they kind of approach that moralizing, the different codes they use. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the audiences, right? That like the local audiences in the Mexican context are seeing these things with their own eyes, right? And able to kind of fit some of that moralizing into what they already know and see. Whereas with the Peruvian ones, again, they're intended for an overseas audience and intended to show that, you know, things are under control here, right? That you might think that we're, you know, surrounded by people of indigenous ancestry and African ancestry and this proliferation, but there's order and there's hierarchy here. There's some contained instances of laziness, et cetera. But overall, there's a sense of order and hierarchy. So there's, I think, a lot that can be done there. And your comment kind of points to some of those points of comparison.
I just thought it's worth saying, since we're in Canada, that in French Canada, in Quebec, there's the old settlers, right? The oldest line of settlers, and often called habitants because of the lands they were given. But the other name for them is pure wool, laine pure. And I just think that's kind of a white sounding thing, right? Yeah. Like pure wool. Yeah. So, wow. It doesn't just contain itself in the Latin American context. It's just weirdly absent in the English tradition.
Interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. It was fascinating and I learned a lot. And I wanted to ask you, there was one thing that struck me as you were speaking, and you can correct me if I'm wrong or if I misunderstood, but you said that in the final case that you were discussing, that Teresa had a knife and she was brandishing the knife. But the thing that seems to be the most important in the case is that she's insulted these people. And I was really struck by that. The thing that was really a threat to them was not that she had a knife. It was not that she was accusing their dog of stealing and sort of impugning them in that way. It was her challenging of their reputation and their racial reputation. And so I would really love it if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that gets to the heart of what this ultimately was about, this conflict, this moment at the front door, that they didn't really feel as though they were physically in danger. And they probably understood that it wasn't going to rise to the level of a physical attack. Not that these things never did rise to the level of physical attacks, because there are cases. There's one that I talk about in the article that involves someone's face being cut with some scissors. So they could in that moment, but they seemed to think in that moment that it wasn't going to get violent in a physical sense, but it was still socially violent. And I think part of what was also threatening to them was the kind of public nature of it all. It's happening at their front door, so they can't deny that it was about them, that it involved them, right? That they couldn't be like, well, that's just something that was happening out on the street. So it was brought to their front door, and in a way that all their neighbors could see. And those are the people that are being called to testify, the neighbors who saw it and who probably took it in, right? Took in these insults and maybe thought differently or were inclined to think differently about their neighbors. Like, well, why are they being called dirty whites and huge whores, right? What did they do to deserve it? Because that is the kind of set of assumptions that are operating in this context, that those things don't happen randomly, right? That there must be some truth to it. And that's why people are so concerned with kind of correcting the record, or at least having these, filing these insult claims, because they understand that it'll stick to them. So yeah, I think it kind of speaks to the instability too of white womanhood, and that it needed to be protected at all times, not just from men's sexual predations, but the potential for other women to insult them in ways that could be heard and stick to them throughout their lives, and possibly even ruin their marriages. Another case I talk about in that piece does involve a woman being called a whore and the daughter of a huge whore, and her husband leaves her, right? So, because the husband doesn't want that to affect his standing. So I think it speaks to the really high stakes nature of these moments, and that people of African descent understood that these were high stakes, and that they didn't have very much power, but they could have the power to take aim at and poke a hole in their pretensions, the Spaniards' pretensions about their status in relation to them. And so I think that is also interesting, the way that these words and these bodily gestures are closing the gap that Spaniards had worked so hard to create.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I always hesitate to say like how lovely that was to hear, but it was really nice to, it was a good presentation. If the topic wasn't great. My question is more 17th century focused, a little earlier. And what I found very striking about this sort of not invention of, but this slippage of and concretizing of Europeanness in Latin America is exactly how not European Europe is at the moment, right? How kind of there is no European, but even more so in Spain, where we have this, in 1630, we're hardly, 2 decades out from Cervantes' Magic Theater, right? Like there's an anxiety about, who's white, who's really Spanish happening in Spain right now that seems to kind of evaporate or get laundered, if you want to use the kind of the metaphoric language, across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of wondering if there, like, what you sort of see amongst, is there this anxiety happening even in sort of this whiteness of like, not only like, are we now white, but really the tense is important. We've become, like we have left this realm where maybe we wouldn't have been able to see the theater, right? Maybe we wouldn't have been able to see the show in Spain, but we sure can in Peru, right? And if you're sort of seeing that, or if it really is this sort of, and it's not really our problem anymore. Thanks.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. In part, it makes me think about something that I'm teaching a class this semester called Afro-Latin America and the Artistic Imagination. And it's both about the visibility of Afro-Latin Americans in kind of artistic production, but also the invisibility of them. And we talked last week about the conquest and the tension between the scholarship that tells us that people of African descent were present among the earliest arrivals to the New World, and were part of Columbus's retinue, were part of Cortez's retinue, and were among the conquering forces, right? And yet, what we see in the visual realm, with few exceptions, is the complete erasure of people of African descent from those moments, from that history and the scenes that kind of detail that history. And we were kind of grappling with why there is that sort of erasure. And I think it kind of does have to do with ideas about Spanishness, because like you said, this is, especially in the early 17th century, there is not that much daylight between the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula and also the fact that Spain itself was a multiracial society, and that the category of Spanish was not a racial category even in the 15th century, because there had been so many people of African descent who had been in Spain for generations. And those are the people who are part of the conquering forces, right? They're not the negros postales de Guinea. They're the people who speak Spanish, who've been Christianized and who were Spanish, right? Born in Spain in many cases, whose parents had been born in Spain. So I kind of see the erasure of people of African descent in those early images as intentional and an attempt to kind of shore up what Spanish means, that it means white. It doesn't mean Moorish. It doesn't mean West African or Central African. It doesn't mean Jewish. It means a kind of old Christian white. And remind me of the second part of your question. Oh, just the preoccupation and maybe just ideas about kind of Spanishness that are playing out on one side of the Atlantic versus the other. Yeah, I think there's an interesting opportunity among Spaniards in the New World to kind of claim an ancestry that, or a mode of belonging that might have been more complicated or precarious in the old world, because there was clearly a distinction. I mean, speaking of kind of genealogical genealogies of racial terminology in the Spanish American context, there's the Creole and the peninsular, right? That there's always, from the earliest moment, a distinction between those Spaniards born in the New World and those Spaniards born in Spain that comes with attendant rights, right? That peninsulars are privileged even in the New World context when it comes to colonial officialdom, positions of authority. That is kind of the core of the conflict that results in the independent struggle in Spanish America. So I do think some of these ideas are kind of being worked out. So that's at least some initial ways of answering and thinking through your question. So thank you. Throw the mic in the air, whoever catches it.
I just want to make sure, thank you again for that, and I find this really fascinating, and I just want to make sure I'm kind of grasping this, because am I getting it right that there wasn't much of a differentiation between either the background being of indigenous ancestry or of African ancestry in the way that this was kind of conceived. So it was, and going off of kind of what we were just heard, it was more about kind of difference from, and just kind of defining oneself as different from, because that's very different from some of the accounts that I've seen, like later in the kind of mission colonial, where they were very obsessed with how, fair this particular group of, Indians was, or this group was very dark. And is that really a characteristic there? If you could speak to that.
Yeah, it's a great question, because it's a reminder to draw a distinction between the ways in which both the Peruvian Casa paintings and I think the kind of logic of Spanish colonial rule operated as it concerned Afro-Spaniards and Indo-Spaniards, because the other narrative within that collection of Casa paintings concerns indigenous people's genealogical progression to whiteness and the seventh generation. So first of all, it takes fewer generations to get to whiteness in the indigenous case. It takes 8 in the case of the ones that we see on screen, but in the case of the indigenous ones, it takes 7 generations. And in that 7th generation, an Español with, I think, a requinterona de mestiza produces an Español. So there is this potential to arrive at whiteness in the case of the kind of indigenous Spaniards, which is in keeping, I think, with some of what you're pointing to in terms of the different paths for belonging and status vis-a-vis indigenous people and African descent people. So yeah, in the interest of time and space, I didn't attend to that other narrative, but I think it fits into this kind of broader picture about the kind of true notion of genealogy that's at play in Genealogies of Whiteness, but also the kind of archival genealogies as well. So thanks for that question.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. I have so many questions. I'm going to try and limit my questions to to just one. I'm really struck by this attempt to like fantasy of taxonomy here, and also just the sort of sheer number of generations. So that the amount of time and if I'm hearing correctly, in this case, you mentioned that the sort of the final generation here is not quite white, right? That there's still a qualification. I'm really curious because right, these attempts to taxonomize are fantasies, and as was discussed earlier, the sort of reality of of genealogy is it's unstable in that way. Is there a discourse of racial passing that interacts with this? Or, I'm thinking in particular of just the reality of phenotypic variation. I'm thinking like by, after one generation or two generation, this paradigm really wouldn't, really is a fantasy that wouldn't map onto reality. So is there a discourse of passing or anything like that that challenges or is trying to, is attempted to be resolved into this?
Yeah, I love the way you put it, the fantasy of taxonomy, because that's precisely what this is, right? That it presumes that you could encounter someone and know their precise ancestral makeup, and that there would be no confusion, right? And meanwhile, the problem, as evidenced in the archival record, is just that there were always moments of confusion, and that there's always a disconnect between how people were described by other people and how they described themselves, right? And that first instance, I think, is one of them, that the cuarterona who describes herself as a mujer blanca is doing that herself. That isn't necessarily how the scribe would have described her. And in fact, the fact that he's asking her to kind of give her racial terms suggests that he wants to mark her in a certain way. And yeah, there's one of the things I talk about elsewhere is that when it was time for people to define themselves, they're not using these terms. These terms only exist in the casta paintings, right? Some of them, mulatto, mestizo, yes, those are terms that we see everywhere in the documentation, but requinterona de mulatto, quasi limpio de sur, these aren't terms that people are using, or even to describe other people. But on the subject of passing, Joanne Rappaport in this article and in the book, The Disappearing Mestizo, I think has a really good way of talking about passing, or at least engaging the concept of passing as it applies to the Latin American context, where that term doesn't appear. And often when scholars of Latin American history invoke it, they're usually invoking it in quotes, in part because there wasn't the same sort of, I hesitated to say there wasn't the same sort of binary, because I think that's also an old-fashioned way of thinking and talking about race in Latin America. But instead, what Joanne Rappaport says is that people weren't passing necessarily, but living the way they believe themselves to deserve to live, right? Where it gets complicated is that there were different ideas, right? And that's why some of these records exist in the first place, that conflict between who someone thought they were and how they deserved to live, and who other people thought they were and how they deserve to be treated. And so that tension is there, and I think that's what allows for Latin America to be placed in useful conversation with the US, not just that, oh, so different so as to be incomparable, but that tension was there in the Latin American context, just as it was in the US context. Obviously, there's different terminology that surrounds all of that, but the core dynamics, I think, are the same.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, I'm going to quickly echo everyone's praise for this. I have a question about the final case and sort of the methodological payoff of going to insults, jokes, those kinds of things. It feels to me like, certainly in the Anglo context, the histories of race, even up to Ibram Kendi, are always intellectual histories from above. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what you think the methodological payoff is for our collective understanding of the kind of lived history of race, to going to these jokes and insults. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that concept of methodological payoff. And I think the answer is also embedded in your question, right? That it gives us a kind of intellectual history of these individuals who didn't have access to writing in the conventional sense and didn't produce the kind of archive that we turn to because it is intact. It's not fragmented, right? It's more comprehensive, and there's lots of good reason to kind of work in those archives, but what it doesn't give us is that pushback too, that sense that, okay, well, that's how you think about yourself, Spaniards, but here's how we think about you, right? And we have our reasons and our long history and our kind of lineage of insults. And I love the idea of jokes too, because, and just like my mind is already going certain places thinking about that, right? And that things get passed down, not necessarily through the written word, but there are these moments in the archive that tell us that they have been passed down and that people are deploying them in intentional and smart ways, right? That there's some strategic work happening that we can get to the bottom of, and that, yeah, like they're not going to appear in the same way, and they're going to ask more of us, right? And because they're so fragmented, there's a sense of patience, that is required. But all that is the work that we're all supposed to be doing anyway, right? Is to kind of ask those questions and compile different types of archives, right? And kind of perhaps push back against these more the tyranny of certain kinds of archival evidence, right? That then results in the tyranny of certain kinds of analyses and scholarship. So I really love that notion of methodological payoff. I might steal it, but then I'll TM you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your questions. And if you could please join me in thanking Professor Walker for such a wonderful talk.
Thank you.